Part 1. The Chalk and the Gaslight. The last set of footsteps had barely faded up the stone staircase when the cold came rushing back in to fill the space they had left behind. Not the sharp, biting cold of the street above, not yet, but the particular cold of a room that had been warm for many hours and was now quietly remembering its own nature. The basement gymnasium at number 14, Clerkenwell Road, existed below the city, the way a held breath exists below speech. It was a subterranean thing, 11 stone steps beneath the pavement. And on a night like this one, on a night when the snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, without any apparent intention of stopping, the world above it seemed to belong to an entirely different order of existence. Mr. Aldous Fenwick stood at the top of those 11 steps for just a moment. He stood with one hand resting on the oak door frame, listening to the sound of his last patron. Young Hargreaves, a clerk from the insurance offices on Gray's Inn Road, making his careful way out onto the pavement. The boy had wrapped his muffler twice around his throat before leaving. Fenwick had watched him do it. He had watched the careful, methodical way the young man had tucked the wool ends down inside the lapels of his overcoat, and there had been something quietly satisfying about that small act of preparation for the world outside. Then the street door at the top of the building had opened, and for just a fraction of a second a breath of the night had come down the stairwell, clean and sharp, and carrying with it the particular silence that only heavy snowfall produces in a city. And then the door had closed, and the young man was gone, and Fenwick was alone. He descended the 11 steps with the unhurried pace of a man who has descended them thousands of times and has long since stopped thinking about them consciously. At the bottom, he took hold of the gymnasium door, a solid, heavy piece of English oak, iron-banded at the corners, with a latch of black iron that required a firm, deliberate press of the thumb. And he drew it shut. The sound it made was not a slam. It was a deep, solid, resonant thud, the kind of sound that a thing makes when it is well made and properly fitted, and it seemed to hang in the air of the gymnasium for a moment before the room absorbed it completely. Then he turned the bolt. The bolt was long and square-shouldered, and moved in its housing with a smooth, firm resistance. And when it seated itself fully in the keep on the far side of the frame, it produced a short, clean, terminal sound. A sound that meant, simply and without ambiguity, that the evening was finished and the night had now begun. The silence that followed that sound was enormous. It is a particular quality of underground rooms that they collect silence the way other rooms collect light. Above the gymnasium, through perhaps 18 inches of London stone and Victorian brick, and the compacted earth between, the city was conducting its late evening business. There were horses out there, he could hear them just barely, as a kind of felt presence more than a true sound. The soft, muffled percussion of hooves on snow-covered cobblestone, the jingle of harness fittings rendered faint and somehow distant, as though heard from the far end of a long corridor. A cart of some kind, moving slowly. The snow was doing something to all of the city's familiar sounds, wrapping them in a material that softened their edges and reduced their carrying power, so that the London outside the basement windows was operating at perhaps a quarter of its usual volume. The basement windows themselves, 2 of them, set high in the north wall at pavement level, their lower panes perpetually frosted with condensation, showed nothing but darkness, interrupted by the slow, steady accumulation of snow on their exterior sills. Each flake was invisible individually, Collectively, they had built over the course of the afternoon and evening a low white ridge along the bottom of each window frame, and that ridge was still growing, almost imperceptibly, minute by minute. Fenwick stood in the center of the gymnasium floor and let the silence settle around him like a garment. The gas lamps were burning at their full evening pressure. He would turn 2 of the 4 of them down before he began his own work, because he preferred to lift in what he privately thought of as a reduced light, a warm and concentrated glow, rather than the broad yellow illumination that the patrons required. But for now, with all 4 lamps burning, the room presented itself in its fullest and most complete form, and he took a moment, as he always did after the last patron left, to simply look at it. The floor was his particular pride. Wide pine boards, close-fitted, sanded to a surface that was not quite smooth enough to slide on in stockinged feet, but with enough grain remaining that the iron plates could be set down without slipping. He had applied 2 coats of linseed oil to those boards himself, on his hands and knees with a piece of flannel, in the autumn of 1887, and every year since then he had repeated the process, and the result was a floor that held light in a particular way. Not a shine exactly, but a warmth, a depth, as though the light were penetrating the surface of the wood rather than simply reflecting from it. The gas lamps caught it now from their 4 positions on the walls, 1 on each wall, iron bracketed, with small ceramic reflectors behind the mantles that threw the light forward and downward, and the floor answered them with a low amber glow that seemed to rise from below rather than fall from above. The weights were arranged along the east wall on their low wooden rack. They were globe barbells, most of them, a design that Fenwick had always preferred to the newer plate-loading configurations that were beginning to appear in some of the more fashionable establishments uptown. A globe barbell was a simple and honest object. It was a bar of iron. In this case, bars of varying length, from perhaps 18 inches to just over 4 feet, with a sphere cast at each end, smooth on the outer curve, but knurled at the equator, where the hand would naturally find its grip. They ranged in weight from a modest 7 pounds, which was used by the lighter patrons and by those beginning their acquaintance with iron, to the heaviest piece in the collection, a long bar with globes each the approximate size of a large man's fist, which tipped the weighing scale at 142 pounds, and which Fenwick could press overhead 11 times on a good evening and 9 times on an ordinary one. All of them were black. The cast iron had oxidized to that particular non-reflective blackness that old iron achieves. Not paint, not rust, simply the natural surface of metal that has been handled regularly and kept dry and has settled into its own final state. They sat on the rack in descending order of weight from left to right, and their arrangement was one of the small visual pleasures of Fenwick's life. Beside the rack of globe barbells, on a separate low stand, were the Indian clubs. There were 14 of them in 7 graduated pairs, and they were made of turned ash wood, a pale, close-grained timber that was dense enough to have real weight without the deadness of iron, each one shaped like an elongated bowling pin with a slender neck and a flared base, smooth where they were meant to be gripped and gently ridged around the belly for identification in low light. The largest pair weighed 8 pounds each. They were used for slow, circular swinging movements that worked the shoulders and the upper back in arcs that no straight-line lifting could replicate, and when swung properly in a warm room, They produced a low whistle of displaced air. Against the south wall on a shelf sat 4 leather medicine balls. These were old. The leather was the dark brown of old saddle leather, softened and darkened by years of handling, and each ball was stitched along its seams with a heavy waxed thread that had been re-stitched in places where it had worn through. They were filled with a mixture of sawdust and sand, and they landed with a sound like a quiet exhalation, a soft thud that seemed to contain within it all the weight of the thing, without any of the hardness. The smell of the room at this hour was its own distinct atmosphere. Chalk dust was the top note, dry and clean and slightly mineral, the residue of the magnesium carbonate that the patrons applied to their palms before gripping the heavier bars, a fine white powder that hung in the air during the busy hours, and then slowly, over the course of the evening, settled onto every horizontal surface. Beneath that was the smell of the pine floor with its linseed oil, and beneath that, older and more permanent, the smell of leather, the medicine balls, the lifting belts hanging on their pegs near the door, the old strap-handled bag that sat in the corner and had been sitting there since the room opened. And threading through all of it, barely perceptible, but always present, a faint metallic cleanness from the iron itself. Fenwick crossed to the small back room, a space no larger than a generous closet, curtained off from the gymnasium proper, with a length of heavy wool fabric in a dark green, and he began to change his clothes. He removed his waistcoat and hung it carefully on the hook behind the curtain. He removed his collar and his cuffs, and set them on the small shelf beside the coal stove, which was burning low and steady in the corner. He changed his trousers for a pair of close-fitting wool serge in a dark navy, and he exchanged his shirt for a thinner one, collarless, off-white, with the sleeves already turned back twice at the cuff. He sat on the low wooden stool and changed his boots for a pair of soft leather slippers with thin soles. He stood. He pressed his palms together once, slowly, feeling the slight resistance of the skin. He breathed in once through the nose and out again through the mouth. The gymnasium was waiting for him, quiet and warm and full of the smell of chalk and old iron, and the muffled, snow-softened sounds of a city settling into its long winter night. He drew the curtain back and stepped through it. Part 2. The Geometry of Iron. He began, as he always began, with the Indian clubs. This was not vanity, and it was not sentiment. It was simply the correct way to begin. The shoulders were the most honest part of the body in Fenwick's private taxonomy of the human frame. They told you, without flattery or evasion, exactly what state the rest of the machinery was in. A cold shoulder moved like a rusted hinge. A properly warmed one moved like something that had been designed by a watchmaker. And so he took the smallest pair of clubs from the stand, the 2-pound pair, pale ash wood smooth and cool in his palms, and he began the slow, deliberate circles. The movement was a full outward mill, both arms together, tracing identical arcs in opposite directions, the clubs sweeping down from above the head, out and around, in a wide lateral circle, and back up again. The motion, when done correctly, produced no sound except the faintest displacement of air and the almost imperceptible creak of the floorboards beneath the slight shifting of his weight. He did not count repetitions in the conventional sense. He counted breaths, 8 full breaths per direction, then a reversal, then 8 more. The rhythm was the thing. It was the thing that separated the physical culturist from the mere enthusiast. The enthusiast lifted weight. The culturist inhabited the movement, resided within it, let the repetition become a kind of walking pace, automatic and sustainable, and deeply, quietly pleasing. He moved through the club pairs in ascending order of weight, spending no more than 4 minutes with each pair, until he arrived at the 5-pound clubs, and here he paused and felt the shoulders properly for the first time. A spreading, liquid warmth across the caps of the deltoids and down into the upper trapezius, and he set the clubs back on their stand with the same quiet care with which he had taken them down. Then he turned to the iron. He selected a globe barbell of moderate weight for his first pressing movement. 46 pounds, a bar of perhaps 2.5 feet with globes each the size of a large orange, the knurling at their equators rough and certain under his chalked palms. He stood before the tall mirror on the east wall. It was a good mirror, silver-backed, in a plain frame of dark-stained pine, and it showed him everything with a kind of unsparing evenness that no amount of flattery could soften. It showed him what the gaslight showed. A man of 37 years, in a collarless shirt and dark wool serge trousers, standing with his feet set at a distance that matched the breadth of his hips precisely, the barbell hanging at arm's length before him. He looked at himself for a long moment before he began. This was part of the practice, not vanity. He had to keep returning to that word and setting it aside, because the untrained observer might have seen a man admiring himself in a mirror, and that reading would have been entirely wrong. This was assessment. This was the quiet, technical business of knowing the instrument before you began to play it. And what the mirror showed him, as it showed him every evening, was that the instrument was imperfect in certain specific and consistent ways. His left chest was larger than his right, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to a casual observer fully clothed, but in the honest, reduced light of the gas lamps, with his shirt fitting close and his arms at rest. The asymmetry was apparent. The left pectoral swept outward from the sternum in a slightly fuller arc. The muscle sat marginally higher, marginally thicker, and because of this, because the left side of the upper body was very slightly more developed, his left shoulder rested perhaps 1/4 of an inch forward of his right. His left side led. It had always led. He was right-handed, but through some early imbalance in his training, the left side of his chest had become the stronger puller, and the body had adapted to that reality in all its patient, architectural honesty. He noted this, he filed it, and he adjusted. He shifted his right hand a thumb's width closer to the right globe, giving his right arm a fractionally longer effective lever, a change so small as to be invisible to any observer, but one that would, over the course of the evening's volume, ask more of the right side and slightly less of the left. He did not chase symmetry with frustration. Frustration was an accelerant, and accelerants had no place in this room at this hour. He pursued symmetry the way a good gardener pursues the shape of a hedge, with patience, with small incremental corrections, with the understanding that the work would not be finished tonight or next month, but that tonight's work would nevertheless bring him fractionally closer to the thing he was attempting. He pressed. The movement was vertical and strict. The bar rose from its position at the sternum's height. Elbows angled slightly forward, not flared wide in the manner of the gymnastic tradition, but set at perhaps 45 degrees to the midline of the body, and it rose in a path that was as close to a perfect plumb line as his anatomy would allow. He did not watch the bar in the mirror. He watched the junction of his collarbones. He watched the space where the two clavicles met the sternum, that small notch of cartilage and bone, and he used it as a fixed point, a reference from which all other measurements were taken. If that point remained still, if the torso did not sway forward or shift laterally, then the movement was honest. The bar reached the top of its arc, with both arms fully extended, elbows soft rather than locked, the weight distributed across the full breadth of the hands, rather than concentrated at the heel of the palm. He held that position for 2 full counts. Not a pause born of struggle. The weight was well within his capacity at this early stage of the session. But a deliberate, conscious pause, a moment of arriving at the top of the movement and taking genuine inventory of what was there. Both arms level, both shoulders level. The left side working, yes, but the right side working with it. Then the descent, which was slower than the ascent. Always slower. The weight coming down with the same strict geometry with which it had gone up. The elbows tracing their same 45-degree path inward. The bar arriving back at its starting position with a control so complete that it made no sound at all. He performed 12 repetitions in this manner. Then he set the bar down, not dropping it, but lowering it through the last few inches with the same deliberate deceleration he had used throughout, until it rested on the floorboards with a sound like a quiet footstep. He rested for as long as it had taken him to perform the set. This was the methodology: equal time working, equal time recovering. Not sitting. He never sat between sets. Standing, breathing, hands on his hips or clasped behind his back, letting the body process what had just been asked of it. The room was very quiet during these intervals. The snow was still falling above him. He could feel its absence of sound more than anything else, that particular atmospheric pressure of a heavy snowfall that seemed to press down through the earth itself and make the basement feel more enclosed, more deeply underground than usual. The gas lamps hissed their low, continuous hiss. One of the lamp mantles on the south wall had a very small imperfection in its weave, and at certain moments of pressure, fluctuation in the supply line, it produced a sound at a slightly different pitch than the other 3. Not unpleasant, simply distinct. And Fenwick had long since incorporated this sound into the room's ambient texture, the way one incorporates the ticking of a familiar clock. He returned to the bar. He pressed again. 12 more repetitions. The same geometry, the same inventory at the top, the same controlled descent. He worked through 5 sets of the overhead press in this manner, then moved without ceremony to the pulling movements. He had rigged in the center of the ceiling's heaviest beam a length of iron pipe fitted with smooth wooden handles at each end. The whole apparatus suspended on 2 lengths of chain, with snap hooks that allowed it to be raised or lowered by a foot in each direction. He had installed this himself, with a brace and bit and a good deal of patience, in the spring of 1891. It was, in the absence of a formal pull-down machine, a practical and elegant solution to the problem of lat development, and he used it now for a slow horizontal rowing movement. Body inclined beneath the bar at a shallow angle, heels on the floor, pulling the chest up to meet the iron rather than pulling the iron down to meet the chest. He was entirely exhausted, not depleted, not broken, exhausted in the precise and satisfying sense of having brought a large capacity to a task that was equal to it, and having found, at the end of that task, that the capacity and the demand had met each other exactly, and that nothing remained on either side. The body was heavy and warm, and thoroughly, completely worked, and every muscle along the entire anterior and posterior chain of the upper body had been addressed in its turn with the same patient, geometric attention, and the work was finished, and the iron was done with for the night. He lay still for one more long moment, listening to the snow. Part 3. The winter-green recovery. He did not rise immediately. This was a discipline in itself, perhaps the most undervalued discipline in the entire practice of physical culture, in Fenwick's considered opinion. The enthusiast finished his last repetition and immediately began moving, began tidying, began filling the silence with purposeful activity, because the silence after great effort was uncomfortable to the untrained mind. It felt like idleness. It felt like time being wasted. The enthusiast did not understand that the minutes immediately following the work were not separate from the work. They were its final chapter. The body, in those minutes, was conducting an enormous amount of internal business, shuttling materials, adjusting pressures, beginning the long cellular conversation that would, over the following days, result in the small incremental changes that were the entire point of the enterprise. To interrupt that process prematurely, with unnecessary movement, was to shortchange the work that had already been done. And so Fenwick lay on the wool blanket and breathed, and let the room be what it was around him. The gaslight hissed. The imperfect mantle on the south wall sang its slightly different note. Somewhere above him, at a distance that the snow made difficult to estimate, a church bell was striking the hour. He counted 11 strokes, each one arriving muffled and rounded at its edges, softened by the accumulated inches of snow on every horizontal surface of the city above. And then the bell was finished, and the silence came back, deeper than before, for having been briefly interrupted. After perhaps 5 full minutes of this stillness, he moved. He rolled to his side first, then brought himself up to seated, then to standing. And in each of these transitions, he moved with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who is paying close attention to what his body is telling him. The telling was detailed and specific. The chest reported a deep settled heaviness across its full breadth, a thickness in the muscle that was entirely distinct from the sharp overextension of injury. This was the heaviness of saturation, of a structure that had been thoroughly and honestly worked, and was now in the early stages of its own recovery. The anterior deltoids, the front heads of the shoulders, which had borne the majority of the pressing work, reported a similar condition, a burning warmth that had moved past its acute phase and settled into something slower and more diffuse. The middle back was the most vocal. The rhomboids in particular had a way of making themselves known after heavy rowing work, not with pain exactly, but with a persistent, spreading ache that ran from the inner edges of the shoulder blades toward the spine. And this ache was present now, thorough and earned, and in its own way, deeply satisfying. He stood for a moment in the center of the floor, hands loose at his sides, and took a slow inventory of all of this. He noted it the way a careful steward notes the condition of a property after a long day's use. Not with alarm, not with pride, simply with attention. Then he crossed to the small shelf beside the door, where the cleaning cloths were kept in a folded stack, and he took the top cloth, and he carried it to the basin of water he kept on the low table near the Indian club stand. The water was cold. It had been lukewarm when he had filled the basin some hours earlier, but the room, despite the coal stove burning in the back, was not truly warm. It was merely less cold than the street above, and the water had given up its heat gradually over the course of the evening, and was now only a degree or two above the temperature of the stone walls. He submerged the cloth, wrung it out with both hands, and began his circuit of the room. The leather benches went first. There were 3 of them, long, low structures of pine frame and thick cowhide, the leather darkened and supple with age, and with the linseed oil he worked into it every few weeks to prevent cracking. He wiped each bench from one end to the other, with slow overlapping strokes, the damp cloth picking up the chalk residue, and the dried sweat that the evening's patrons had left behind. The chalk came away in pale gray smears on the cloth. The leather beneath it was almost black in places, nearly brown in others, and it accepted the cold water with a slight darkening of its surface that would dry back to its usual color within the hour. He folded the cloth to a clean face and wiped the underside of each bench as well, where chalk dust had a way of accumulating along the edges of the frame. The globe barbells went back to their rack in silence. Several of them had been left on the floor by the later patrons, not carelessly, not maliciously, simply with the tiredness of men who had worked hard, and whose attention to the room's order had diminished as their energy had. Fenwick did not resent this. It was part of the custodial character of what he did, this final accounting of the room's contents, and he moved through it with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. He lifted each barbell by its bar with both hands, carried it to the rack, and placed it in its correct position. Heaviest at the left, lightest at the right, the globes of each bar aligned so that their knurled equators faced the room rather than the wall. This last detail was perhaps unnecessary in any practical sense, but it mattered to him in the same way that the arrangement of the tools in a good carpenter's workshop matters, not for efficiency exactly, but for the integrity of the space, for the signal it sent to the room, and to the next person who would enter it, that this was a place of attention. When the last barbell was seated in its place, he stood back and looked at the rack. The black iron sat in its ordered rows in the amber gaslight, and the knurled bands caught the light at their raised ridges, and threw it back in a series of tiny parallel glints. It was a small and unremarkable beauty, the kind of beauty that exists in the precise arrangement of useful objects, and Fenwick stood with it for a moment before moving on. He returned to the basin, submerged the cloth again, wrung it out, and wiped down the handles of the overhead bar, the smooth wooden grips, warm from the evening's use, accepting the cold cloth with a faint whisper of steam that was gone almost before it registered. He wiped the Indian clubs in their pairs, running the cloth around the belly of each one and down the slender neck and across the smooth base. He wiped the shelf where the medicine balls sat, and the medicine balls themselves, and the wall behind the rack where chalk-dusted hands had occasionally rested. Then the cloth went into the basin for the last time, and the basin was set aside, and the room was clean. He settled onto the long bench nearest the south wall, and sat for a moment with his forearms resting on his thighs, his hands open and relaxed, the fingers very slightly curled the way the hand naturally falls when all its tension is released. The ache in the middle back had deepened slightly with the activity of the cleaning circuit, as he had known it would. Moving after heavy effort always produced a temporary intensification of the muscular response before the eventual easing, and the shoulders were making themselves known again, the front deltoids in particular. A slow radiating warmth that spread upward toward the neck and downward toward the elbow. He reached beneath the bench and drew out the tin. It was a flat, circular tin of perhaps 4 inches in diameter, its lid pressed down firmly enough that it required both thumbs to prise open. The label was printed in dark green ink on a cream ground and read, in a plain serif typeface, camphorated oil of wintergreen, prepared for muscular use. The tin had been recommended to him by a Scottish wrestler of his acquaintance some years previously, a man who had worked with iron for 30 years and whose understanding of muscular recovery was empirical and unsentimentally thorough, and Fenwick had used it ever since, without any intention of stopping. He opened the tin. The smell arrived before anything else. It was a sharp, penetrating, clean smell, the winter-green note coming first, a high and almost sweet medicinal brightness that hit the back of the nasal passages immediately and produced an involuntary widening of the airways, the kind of involuntary response that is not unpleasant but is entirely impossible to ignore. Behind the wintergreen came the camphor, deeper, heavier, slightly resinous, with an edge of something almost woody, and beneath both of those, the carrier oil itself, a neutral and faintly waxy base that held the active elements in suspension. Together, the 3 components produced a smell that was simultaneously stimulating and deeply calming, a smell that Fenwick had come to associate so thoroughly with recovery and rest, that the mere act of opening the tin had a measurable effect on his level of physical tension. The contents of the tin were a pale, off-white preparation, semi-solid at room temperature, with a surface that the spatula left smooth marks across. He took a modest amount on the first 2 fingers of his right hand and began with the left shoulder. The application was slow and deliberate, with the full surface of the fingers rather than the tips, pressing with sufficient firmness to move through the surface layer of the skin and engage the muscle beneath. He worked in small circles at first, beginning at the cap of the deltoid and moving across the front head toward the clavicle, then back and around toward the side and the rear. The liniment spread under the warmth of the friction and began its work almost immediately, the wintergreen producing its characteristic cooling sensation on the surface of the skin, a sensation that was paradoxically accompanied by a deep internal warmth as the camphor worked its way into the muscle tissue beneath. He had never fully understood the chemistry of this dual effect, and had long since stopped trying to. It was sufficient that it worked, and it worked thoroughly. He spent perhaps 6 or 7 minutes on the left shoulder alone, moving from the deltoid to the upper trapezius, working the base of the neck with the heel of his palm, pressing carefully along the length of the clavicle where the muscle attachments clustered. Then the right shoulder received the same attention, the same slow circles, the same firm pressure, the same patient working of each structure in its turn. The smell was now filling the entire room. It had moved from the immediate vicinity of the bench and distributed itself through the still basement air, mixing with the chalk dust and the linseed oil and the faint coal smoke that drifted in from the back room, and the combination was extraordinary, in a way that Fenwick never quite managed to take for granted. The sharp, bright wintergreen note cutting through the older, earthier smells of the room, the camphor adding its depth, the whole composition producing something that smelled, improbably, like concentrated industry and rest at the same time. He worked the chest next, though this required more care and less pressure, the anterior surface of the pectoral being more accessible, but also more sensitive than the deep posterior structures he had already attended to. He spread the preparation across the full breadth of the left pectoral, from the sternal attachment to the outer edge, where the muscle curved around toward the armpit, feeling the slight difference in density between the left side and the right. The left still marginally fuller, even now, even at the end of an evening that had been specifically designed to address that asymmetry. And he noted this without commentary, and worked the oil into both sides with the same unhurried equality of attention. Outside, the snow was still falling. He could feel it the way he always felt it at this hour, as a kind of profound muffled blankness above the ceiling, a presence defined entirely by absence of sound. The horse traffic had ceased entirely now. There was nothing moving on Clerkenwell Road. The city, or at least this small portion of it, had surrendered to the weather and gone inside, and the result was a silence so complete that the hiss of the 4 gas lamps seemed, in comparison, almost loud. When the liniment work was finished, he sat for a long moment, with his hands resting palms up on his thighs, the residual preparation on his fingers still producing its cooling work against the air. The ache in the shoulders and chest had not disappeared. It would not disappear for another day at least. But it had changed character. It had softened at its edges, become less a presence and more a texture, a quality of the tissue rather than a message from it. The middle back had quieted to a low, even warmth. The body as a whole had arrived at that particular state that follows great effort and proper recovery. Not the absence of sensation, but a fullness of it, a deep and settled physical awareness that was as close to contentment as the body knew how to express. He rose from the bench slowly and crossed the room. At the first lamp, the one nearest the door on the north wall, he reached up and turned the brass valve a quarter turn to the left. The flame reduced immediately, the bright yellow shrinking to a smaller, warmer orange, and the shadows in the northeast corner of the room deepened and expanded, reclaiming the space they had occupied before the evening began. He moved to the second lamp on the west wall and turned it down in the same manner. Then the third on the south wall, the one with the imperfect mantle, which produced its slightly different note even as the flame diminished, holding its pitch a moment longer than the others before settling into a lower register. The room was now in a deep amber half-darkness, the objects along the walls reduced to shapes rather than details. The rack of iron a long, dark form. The medicine balls, 3 dim spheres on their shelf. The benches, broad, low masses in the middle of the floor. The polished pine reflected what little light remained as a deep, almost bronze warmth, and the 2 basement windows, dark with snow and night, gave nothing back at all. He turned down the final lamp on the east wall beside the mirror. The gymnasium became shadow. From the back room, through the gap in the heavy wool curtain, came the only remaining light, the low, steady, reddish-orange glow of the coal stove, spilling softly through the curtain's edge and laying a warm bar of color across the last 2 feet of the gymnasium floor. It was a modest light. It was enough. Fenwick stood for a moment in the near darkness, listening to the room settle around him, and then he turned and stepped through the curtain toward the warmth. Part 4. The Coal Stove and the Snow. The back room was small, in the way that only genuinely useful rooms are small. It was not cramped. Cramped implies a deficiency, a room that has fallen short of what it ought to be. This room had never intended to be anything other than what it was, a space of perhaps 10 feet by 8, with a ceiling that followed the slope of the foundation arch above it, and came down on the far side to within a few inches of a man's head. The walls were bare brick, the same London stock brick as the rest of the basement, and they had been whitewashed at some point in the building's history, though the whitewash had long since yellowed to the color of old paper, and in places had flaked away entirely, leaving patches of bare brick the color of dried clay. There was a cot against the east wall, a small table with a single wooden chair beside the south wall, a shelf above the table, holding 3 books and a candlestick and a tin mug, and in the corner nearest the curtain, set on a square of fireproof tile, the coal stove. The coal stove was a small cast-iron thing, of no particular elegance or distinction, a functional object designed and manufactured with no decorative ambition whatsoever. It stood on 4 short legs, each leg no more than 3 inches in height, so that the body of the stove sat very close to the tile beneath it. It had a single door on its front face, hinged at the bottom and latched at the top, with a simple iron catch, and a flue pipe that rose from the top and passed through the ceiling above in a ceramic collar, carrying the smoke up through the building's internal wall and out through a small pot on the roof. The stove was perhaps 18 inches tall and 14 inches wide, and it weighed, Fenwick estimated, somewhere in the region of 60 pounds, and it was the most important object in the room. He had banked it before the evening patrons arrived, loading the firebox with a careful arrangement of larger coal pieces, set over a bed of smaller coke and ash from the previous day, with the damper set to allow just enough draw to maintain a slow, sustaining burn throughout the evening. The result, arriving back in the room now after the long hours of work, was a firebox that had burned down to a deep bed of glowing orange and red embers, not ash, not yet, but the late-stage coal that had given up its volatile gases hours ago, and was now simply radiating its stored heat in a slow, steady exhalation, like a living thing breathing out. The room was warm, not the aggressive warmth of a freshly stoked fire, but a permeated warmth, a warmth that had soaked into the brick walls, and the wooden furniture, and the very air of the small space over many hours, so that it had an even encompassing quality, the warmth of something that had been warm for a long time and intended to remain so. Fenwick stood in front of the open stove door for a moment, looking at the embers. The light they produced was the deepest red he knew. Not orange, not yellow. Red, a true and saturated red at the heart of the largest remaining pieces, fading at their edges to a dimmer orange, and then to the pale gray of the ash that was beginning to form at the very outer surfaces. He could feel the radiant heat on his face and on the fronts of his forearms from a distance of 3 feet. It was a clean heat, dry and even, with none of the dampness that came from a badly managed fire or a poorly drawing flue. He took the coal scuttle from its place beside the stove. It was a plain iron scuttle, slightly dented on one side from an old encounter with the stone floor, and it was still perhaps 2/3 full from that morning's filling. He took the small shovel from its hook on the wall and loaded it once, a moderate, considered load of coal, perhaps 1.5 pounds of the black irregular lumps, and placed it carefully onto the bed of embers, distributing the new coal in a loose layer rather than a pile, so that the heat from below could move up through the spaces between the pieces and begin the work of ignition evenly, rather than concentrating it in one place. The reddish light moved across the ceiling and was gone. Outside, a single flake met the iron grate and came to rest. The breathing slowed further, and the blankets were warm, and the room was warm. And 11 steps above, the snow continued to fall on the quiet city, covering everything, softening everything, pressing its gentle and impartial weight on the rooftops and the railings and the cobblestones and the pavement of Clerkenwell Road. And the man in the small back room beneath all of it breathed out once more, slowly, completely, and did not breathe in again for a long moment. And when he did, the breath was slower still, and quieter, and the coal stove ticked its soft and irregular tick in the warm dark, and the snow fell, and the night deepened, and there was nothing left to do, and nowhere left to be, and the heavy, honest body rested.